Good evening, everyone. Am I on here? Hi, folks. I'm Chris Nemechek, and I'm the director for the Center for the Liberal Arts, and we welcome you to our inaugural Call 300 visit this fall semester. As you know, the Call 300 experience seeks to join our students with the people, places, and ideas that lift them out of their familiar surroundings and deepen the way they see themselves in the world. This part of the COLL curriculum aspires to stimulate an experience of productive disorientation that allows our students to see their own lives in a broader perspective. There are a number of ways you all fulfill those experiences. Some study abroad, others engage in study away opportunities. The final category of COLL 300 experiences is what brings us together this afternoon, the on-campus COLL 300. This encompasses courses that address a faculty-proposed theme and engaged with one of three visitors to campus, faculty-proposed themes and a proposed visitor that we bring to campus to support that theme. This semester's theme is Bodies That Matter. Whether exploring complex interaction of celestial forces or contemporary questions of social justice, scholars recognize that all bodies exist within broader systems that create parameters of possibility for their significance and action. Our COLL 300 courses this semester examine a variety of topics, including how bodies are conceptualized differently in distinct contexts across the globe, how bodies transform their surrounding environments, and how scholars can stimulate recognition of overlooked, undervalued, or alienated bodies. We're delighted to have as our first visitor this semester Fredy Peccerelli, a forensic anthropologist and the director of the Guatemalan Forensic Anthropology Foundation. Momentarily, I'm going to turn things over to our very own Betsy Conifal, Associate Professor of Anthropology and a Fellow with the Center for the Liberal Arts, to introduce him. But before I do, I want to thank all of the Center, first of all, the Center for the Liberal Arts Fellows, our Associate Director, Ben Boone, and Administrative Assistant Extraordinaire, Sharon Morris, who have worked very hard to make Fredy's visit possible and productive. I also want to thank our co-sponsors in this event, Dean Conley and the Arts and Sciences Dean's Office, the Reef Center for International Studies, the programs in Latin American Studies and Hispanic Studies, the Department of History and Anthropology, and the COLL 300 instructors for their commitment to the COLL curriculum and specifically to the COLL 300 program. So thanks for all for being here tonight, and Betsy, I'll let you take it over.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Betsy Conifal. I'm actually from the history department. No, but that's absolutely fine. I love anthropology, and we're welcoming an anthropologist with us here today. So I'm very pleased to introduce our guest. He is, as Chris said, the first of the COLL 300 visitors to address the theme Bodies That Matter. Fredy Peccerelli is a forensic anthropologist and executive director of the Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala, FAFG. Fredy leads teams of investigators working to uncover the identity of victims of mass human rights abuses and establish the facts behind their disappearances. FAFG combines forensic archaeology, anthropology, and genetics to address some of the most harrowing human rights crimes of our time. In Guatemala, this has meant investigations into over 1,900 cases of mass killings and disappearances from the armed conflict from 1960 to 1996. Fredy himself left Guatemala after his father received death threats in the 1980s. As a result, he grew up in Brooklyn and became a Yankees fan. In college, he discovered forensic anthropology and returned to Guatemala, supposedly for a year. That was some 2 decades ago. He has helped to create something extraordinary. When FAFG works to uncover atrocities from the past, the bodies that matter very much include the living. The loved ones of the massacred and disappeared, the communities reclaiming and reburying the dead. I would add to this the Guatemalan social body itself, struggling to uncover a history grounded in truth. FAFG is one of the most important components of that process. Their work and evidence has far-reaching legal implications as well. Fredy provided expert testimony, first in Guatemalan human rights trials in Spain and in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. More recently, he's been active in cases in Guatemalan national courts. He testified in the groundbreaking 2013 genocide trial in Guatemala against former head of state Efraín Ríos Montt, and in the retrial of his intelligence chief. This is an ongoing process, and the verdict in that case is expected next week. At the same time, FAFG's expertise is sought far beyond Guatemala. Fredy has served as an expert witness in cases before the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia. He's been involved in investigations into disappearances in Sri Lanka, in Mexico, in Colombia. FAFG is now gearing up to investigate crimes against Rohingya. This work is based in the science of investigating bones and holes in the earth. Fredy insists, or tries to insist, that this is not human rights activism. But because of its importance and repercussions for truth and justice, he keeps winning human rights awards, despite his plea, please don't give these to me. So I won't mention them, but I will note that he's been recognized as Time Magazine and CNN's 50 Latin American leaders of the new millennium. It gives me hope that there are 49 others even a little bit like him. I'm profoundly grateful that he's taken the time to be here with us. Please join me in welcoming Fredy Peccerelli.
Wow, that was by far the best introduction I've ever gotten, ever. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've spoken to 4 or 5 classes, so this is the most difficult presentation I have because I don't want to bore you with the same stuff. And because Ben insisted while we were riding on Pepe over and over, the electronic car, that it had to be about me and how I got involved, that I'm gonna show you a couple of pictures of me. So this is little Fredy, the closest I will probably ever get to having a six-pack. Growing up in Guatemala, this is in a river by my father's town. And I am the son of Fredy Petrelli Sr. and Carmencita. And I have a brother and a sister, Bianca and Gianni. But my dad was a half Italian, so that's my Italian grandfather on your right. And that's my dad beginning to work out until eventually he became Mr. Central America, 6 years in a row. So I am not the famous Fredy Peccerelli of Guatemala at all. Everyone only knows, and everyone always asks me, "Are you the son of the big guy?" It's like, yeah, that's my dad. And not only was he a bodybuilder, but he's the one in the white mask. He's also a professional wrestler and made 6 movies, Mexican movies, with the famous wrestlers. So very hard act to follow. But that was sort of my life in Guatemala up to 1980. In 1980, my dad was the sub-delegate of the Guatemalan committee to the Olympics, the 1980 Olympics. So it was like the flag and then my dad. But if you remember, well, you guys don't remember, but the professors who remember, 1980 Olympics were boycotted by the US. They were in Moscow. So when my dad came back, the fact that he had gone to Russia, along with the fact that he had participated at a very young age, and that's his school even now. His school is called La Normal. It's a very politically active school. I think he was 14 or 15, and he was already protesting in the streets, something that unfortunately we don't see much anymore. But because he had been involved in those protests, And because he had gone to Russia, he was accused of being a communist, which intellectually he might have been at the time. He was definitely in favor of changing the status quo. Things were not good in Guatemala. But that led for him to get death threats. And he left Guatemala in 1980, in September. Then my mother and my sister in October. And then my brother and I were taken to New York, to the Bronx, by our grandparents. So that Yankee Stadium, for those of you who don't know it, the old Yankee Stadium, see the buildings in the back there, that's where I grew up. Up there. So I lived really close to the stadium. And during that first year and a half, that was where I hid. That's where I decided that I would spend my time, because not being in Guatemala was just too painful. I don't know. I mean, I sympathize and empathize with people who come here because they have to. Immigrants that are fleeing from a difficult situation. And I was only 9, and I got to tell you, it was the worst thing ever. I couldn't see my grandparents. I couldn't see my friends. Simple things like I couldn't use my top because there was no dirt. Like everything was covered in, pavement or concrete. And all those little things made a big difference. And not only that, but although Guatemala is a very racist country, it wasn't the type of racism that I encountered in the Bronx, which was one group against the other, literally one street against the other. I wasn't ready for that. So we try to be as normal as possible. That's me with the big hair. And with my little sister, Bianca, in Disney, as a matter of fact. And that's me growing up in Brooklyn. We moved to Brooklyn. And that's my cousin in the front from Sweden, and my brother in the back. So yes, I also have a cousin that lives in Sweden. I have several of them that live in Sweden. Because a lot of my family had to leave Guatemala. One of my uncles left and lived in Sweden for the same reasons. But eventually, when I was in Brooklyn College towards the end, close to graduating, I was forced to read a book called Ay Rigoberta Menchú in a Core 9. I don't know if you guys, Core 9 was a class combined 2 country studies. And I got South Africa and Guatemala, and I was like, yeah, Guatemala, a breeze. And what it did is it put me in touch with a reality that I'd been hiding from for many, many years. And so when I read this book, it became really clear to me that I wanted to go back. But because I have a little bit of imagination, I wanted to go back in style. So I figured I'd be Indiana Jones. So, and the reason was because I could, in my mind, I could become a Mesoamerican archaeologist, become a professor in a university, and during the summers go down to Guatemala and spend it digging in the ruins. That was my plan. And believe it or not, I came here in 1994 to this very university for a historical archaeology conference. And it wasn't really historical archaeology, so we just went to Busch Gardens instead, right? But, sorry. But then we went to Atlanta later that year to the American Anthropology Association meeting, and that's when I met one of the people the person that changed my life. And after listening to all of the archaeologists speak, they didn't inspire me. I'm sorry. And I'm sorry if there are archaeologists here. I love you guys, but it didn't do it for me. So I went back to the hotel, a bit upset, and I looked through the program and I found a lecture from this guy. The name of the lecture was Exhuming the Past from Guatemala to Kurdistan by Dr. Clyde Snow. And sure enough, when Clyde walked onto the stage with his hat and his cowboy boots, I was like, oh my God, this guy's amazing. And it's like the real Indiana Jones. And the first thing he did first image was a slide of a grave in Guatemala and some young people digging the bodies out. And then really it was as if I was struck by lightning right there and then. And I went up to Clyde and I said, is there any way I can get involved? And he said, where are you from? I said, Guatemala. So he invited me to come to Guatemala, and I moved back to Guatemala in '95. Those are my kids, Ashley and Tristan. It's my family now. They're all grown up. That's Bailey and Bella. And so I went back. And I had no idea. I mean, no idea. Most of you today know more about Guatemala than I did when I went back. Because I really went back because I knew about theology, and I wanted to work in anthropology and archaeology and in Guatemala. But I had no idea that there was a conflict that lasted for 36 years. I mean, I knew that we were there because there was bad people in Guatemala, and I knew we were there because things were not great. But I didn't know there was 200,000 victims. I didn't know there was 669 massacres committed, and that 160,000 people were killed in those massacres, or that there were 40,000 people disappeared. And so I began to understand. And the reality is that the work that we do is about the surviving family members, about the people that continue to look for their loved ones, about the ones that don't have answers, about the ones that need the truth and need justice. And this is the guy that showed me everything from day one, how to approach this from the other side, how to put yourself in the victim's place, how to treat people with respect, how to tell people the truth, and how to not be paternalistic when you speak to somebody, how to treat people as equals. And so I began to go to exhumations and to learn from Clyde. That's me still with hair. And wearing my Brooklyn College t-shirt in a cave 25 meters down, a cave where they threw 16 bodies and that we were recovering. These are some of the other people that were there early on. Claudia, Lionel, they're still there with me. And Chamelo, the sub-director. And Lionel and Claudia. We are now a team of 75 people with different disciplines that do this work. But it was always based around the idea that we could identify these bodies and give them back to their loved ones. That was a central idea. From there, all these other things happened, like when you give somebody the body of a loved one that they've been missing for a long time, you also dignify their memory, and you create a space for memory, and a space to talk about history, and a space to talk about justice. I didn't know any of that. And when we began to realize it was when the Truth Commission, while the Truth Commission started working, they came to us and they said, listen, we have all this testimony, but we want to see if we can corroborate it with some evidence, some physical evidence. Can you conduct 4 exhumations for us? And I was like, yeah, are you kidding me? The Truth Commission? Hell yeah. So we said, okay, what do you want? And they had these 4 cases they wanted us to look at. Panzos was the first massacre in Guatemala. That was in early 1978. About 95 to 100 people died, and there's more victims reported, but we only found 35. But this was, the important thing about this case, it was the first massacre, and this was a protest gone wrong. The second case was a military base. So this was early on, where people said, oh, the bodies were being taken to this military base, and we only found 18 bodies here, but it was very important early on. This case is probably one of my most memorable cases, Chell. This is a scorched earth case. This is a massacre. The military came to this place in the mountains in Chahul, in Quiche, and they showed up about, I think it was like 6 in the morning. Most of the men had left to work already, so they surrounded the community and they put all the women and children, they separated the women and children, then eventually started taking them to that bridge. This bridge right here. And this testimony says that there was a fire and that they would take the little babies and throw them alive in the fire. And then they would lean people over the railing of the bridge and hit them in the head with machetes, take them by the feet and throw them over the bridge. They would then fall into the river, and then the river would take them. This is the river over there. You can't really see the bridge, unfortunately, but there's like a 5-meter fall to some boulders. Then the river begins to run, and then there's this second waterfall. So there's 2 falls, and then there's this lagoon. These are some of the guys that saw what was happening but couldn't do anything from the mountain. And when they saw that the river was taking the bodies, went down river, cut some trees, and were able to stop 60 bodies there. And during 10 days, they carried those 60 bodies up about a 500-meter vertical climb. I mean, it was like going up a ladder. How they did it, I will never know. Not only because of the weight, but because, I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen a body that's been floating in the water for 10 days. It's terrible. And of course, these are their loved ones. When they did it, I still don't understand how they ever did it. They took them up to a clearing, and they buried them in graves. This is us digging in 4 of the graves. And we found 60 bodies. That's the Truth Commission. That's one of the Truth Commissioners, Otilia Lush, who came to visit the site. And this is the community helping us take the remains that we place inside paper bags and cardboard boxes, because that's how we maintain them the best. If you put them inside plastic boxes, they continue to decompose. So I'm going to show you, I hope the sound is on. It's an HDMI. I want to show you a testimony, because we just did these interviews we just did recently. The first girl, is a survivor. And the second man, they're both survivors, but the girl was thrown over the river. And I only heard this recently, but just remember what I said, and then listen, or at least read, because she speaks in Spanish, but read the subtitles. Hopefully this works.
Cuando lleguemos a la puente, con el puente, y ahí está el sangre, está mucha sangre, está en el puente, y dice mi mamá conmigo, no vas a parar la sangre, mija, porque no sirve, dice mi mamá. Después, y ahí está el soldado allí. Y mirando a mi mamá, y ahí está mi mamá, me tira el soldado por el río. Yo lo digo que no lo siente, que le tira en el río, y ser más bajito, lo se siente. Y el sol una vez entra a mi cara. Mami, ¿dónde estoy? Sacar en el río, digo yo con mi mamá. Pero no está mi mamá, está muerta, está muerta, está muerta, está muerta. Todo muerto está.
En 1981 empezaron la masacre de gente de aquí. A las 6 de la mañana entraron los ejércitos y a juntar la gente. Muchos ancianos mataron. Mataron ancianos hombres y ancianas mujeres, y mataron las mujeres de embarazados, y mataron los niños. Mi papá no hay. No está mi papá y mi mamá. Cuando yo lo fui a ver en el puente, pues me puso una gran tristeza, porque mi papá no tiene el hilito, y mi mamá, mis hermanos no tienen el hilito, sino que yo lo vi como fue la macheteazos, pescuezos a su cabeza, mi papá, mi mamá. Ese todavía no me sale ese dolor, digamos.
That was Chell. The fourth case, Akul. Akul it's a beautiful community. They make some of the best cheese in the country in that little town. There's a farm, and that Italian farmers use right next door to the town to make cheese. And they now have cabins, you can go stay there, and it really is a beautiful place. But back in 1982, the military showed up to the town, and they had a guy with them wearing a hood. And when they put the entire community together, he picked out 23 men. 5 of the men ran, and 4 of them were shot down as they were running. And they were shot from behind, and we saw that in the trauma. The 5th guy they took and they tied to a tree, and they used him as target practice. The other 18 were taken inside the church, made to lay on the floor. And they threw leaves and dirt on them, and they made the rest of the community jump and walk on them for hours. While that was happening, they told the elderly in the town to go to the cemetery and to dig a grave, a big grave. That's where the graves were, because eventually there's two graves, the one of the 5 and the one of the 18. And what happened was that they took the 18 men with the entire community there, and they made them stand one by one in front of the grave, and one by one with an M16, they shot them in the head. And their heads exploded, and the bone fragments fell into the grave, and the bodies fell into the grave, one after another, 18 times. And that's exactly what we found. We found metal fragments, we found bullets. You can see this is the second grave of the 5 bodies laid down neat next to each other. And this is some parts of the excavation of the first grave that we had to use sticks because since the skulls were completely fragmented because of the high velocity gunshot wounds, we wanted to make sure that we could see them all because it's impressive when you see what that does to a body. Of the 23, only 1 didn't have a gunshot wound, and it's probably because you didn't see it in the skeleton. The other thing we found is when we got to the bottom of the grave, we saw that there was, in the floor of the grave, we saw that there was some circles, darker circles than the natural soil. So we cut a profile, and then what we saw was that it kept going down. So we cut one out. This one we put it on its side, and at the end of it is a bullet. So this told us that they also shot into the grave, and we could see where they were standing when they were shooting into the grave. So basically everything that the testimony told us was corroborated by the physical evidence, including, you see the arm position? I mean, it doesn't take much to understand it. They had the hands tied behind their back. We found documents. And then probably one of my most memorable cases. We found, one night, this was close to Christmas. It was December 18th, 19th. We wanted to finish, but we had to do it properly. So we were working late. It started raining, and I usually exhume bodies from the feet upward when I can, but this grave was really commingled, so I had to start this body from the head down. And I only got right to the pelvic area. And I couldn't continue. So I went back to the hotel, which was a hotel. It was a little place that you stay in the town. It wasn't a hotel. And the next morning, I told Claudia, can we go back early? I want to skip breakfast. Let's just take a photographer with us. Let the rest of the team go eat breakfast, and we'll go early. I just want to finish that body. So we went, just 3 of us. Some of the community came by to help us. And these legs, by now it's only half a body, face down. I finished cleaning them, and I turn them over, and I see this belt buckle. It's a bronze belt buckle. And I said, wow, this is really peculiar looking. I mean, we always find belt buckles, but this one looks really different. And somebody says, oh, I know the guy who's looking for his son. I said, oh, could you go get him, please? So they went to get him. The old man comes, and I said, listen, they tell me, this is outside the grave now, and they tell me that you're looking for a belt buckle. Is this the belt buckle you're looking for? He doesn't say anything, and he's, after 10 seconds, but I thought it was 10 minutes, he just steps back, and he's wearing the same belt buckle. Then he tells me the story that he was walking through a cornfield, and he found a piece of metal. He took it back to his friend, and from that metal, his friend made 2 belt buckles. One he gave to his son, and one he was wearing. When we finished this case, everyone in the community, and this is the important thing here, the community participation, because everyone here was always with us and always participating in everything we did. And that's what we try to bring to every one of these cases. Once again, when we got to the lab, everything that we'd seen in the field was confirmed. They were all gunshot wounds, and eventually we were able to return the bodies to the community. Those cases, those 4 cases, are the basis and the pillars for everything we do. And then, since then, we now have our own DNA laboratory, and I've spoken to many of you about how we do that, and that we look at cemeteries and the clandestine graves, and also in the military installations. And we do that by looking at victim investigation, well, using techniques of victim investigation and documentation, forensic archaeology, anthropology, and forensic genetics. I'm just gonna run really quickly through some pictures for those of you who haven't seen them. But in the investigation part, we do 3 things. We do an antemortem interview, all the information we can about the victim. We take DNA samples using buccal swabs, and we do genograms or genealogies of the families to understand them. In archaeology, we look for the graves. Look for the graves usually is through trenching. We clean the remains to eventually exhume them, and the most important thing there is to make sure we know the difference between one skeleton and another, or between one person and another, one body and another. Of course, the most important thing is to document, right? This might have to be recreated in a court of law of a family, so everything is documented. Pictures, forms, drawings, everything. Then we get to the lab, where we analyze the remains, and more documentation, a lot of cleaning, and more documentation. We write the case number on each bone. There's 206 bones in the human body. Each bone gets the number. And more documentation. And then there's a lot of reconstruction as well with these skulls that have gunshot wounds. Here you could see an entry gunshot wound to the back of the skull here. And you can see clearly the damage that can do to the bone. This one is another gunshot wound that's coming in from the top and going down sort of in through the nose and then out through under the chin. These are different machete wounds, many of them, as you can see. Other cut wounds in the cervical area, these are common. A lot of the trauma we see is around the head, the neck, or the thorax. Because this is not combat trauma. This is not accidental shots. These are shots that mean to kill people. These were executions. There's a lot of children, like I told you, about 30%. Did I tell you that was a question in the other class, I think? It was about 30% of children. And then sometimes the bodies come in still with the blindfold on, and we have to make sure we document them properly. Finally, we'll take a cut from the bone, and we'll put it into our DNA. We'll give it to our DNA lab, where the whole process of extraction and, sample collection, DNA extraction, amplification of specific regions for PCR, and for the nuclear part, the nuclear DNA, and separation and detection of amplified regions. That will later look like this in a profile, and then later we'll compare in a database. So far, we have 14,637 genetic profiles of family members, of relatives, and 4,016 of skeletons. And again, we don't have more because it's a matter of resources. It's not a matter of we can do more. We can do a lot more. But what we want to hopefully achieve is this, to be able to give the bodies to the families so they can have a proper, dignified burial. Do I still have time? A little bit of time? 5? No? Okay, sorry. Cholusinai, this is a pretty current case, and I just want to show you some pictures of this. This is another military base. This is in Quetzal. It's also in Quiche. It takes quite a while, about 6 hours to get there. And this is a former military base in this town that moved 3 times. It was in the town twice. We have found bodies in those places as well. But this is where it was at the longest period of time. And this is in a hill overlooking the town, so it was more strategic as well. And there's talk there of something I'd never heard of before, flag ceremonies, which was they would make communities come to the military base and hand them a flag. They were then supposed to go back to their towns and fly the flag. If they saw that flag flying in that town, that means the town was with the military and it was okay. If they didn't see the flag, everyone in the town would die. But when they brought people there to give them the flags, sometimes they would execute people, so make sure that everyone understood what they meant. So around that area, there's 603 family members have given samples that represent 229 families and 272 victims. So we're looking for 272 people there. This is some of the site is big. Usually these locations are quite big and extensive, so a lot of walking, a lot of digging. But we did find graves, 25 graves containing in those different areas. This is some of the maps that you'll see that we create. The families are always there, like I said. 13 were mass graves, 11 were individual graves, for a total of 25 graves, and a minimum number of 80 individuals. So 80 people represented. As usual, and those of you who have seen the other presentations, there's always something that's used for immobilization, ropes, wires, sometimes around the neck, around the hands, blindfolds, etc. We did find ballistic evidence or metal fragments that looked like bullets, like this one. It's difficult to confuse that with anything else. The age, most of them were adult, 26 to 49, about 47 of them. And there's a lot of trauma again, a lot of gunshot wounds. A lot of gunshot wounds and blunt force trauma, a lot of gunshot wounds and sharp, well, two of them that had gunshot wounds, but also cut wounds, and also some that had hack wounds, but also had stab wounds. We were able to see the cause of death in some of them, and incredibly enough, this is one of the few cases that every single one of the bodies gave us a complete DNA profile. That generated so far 48 identifications. That's more than half of them already, and we're continuing to try to identify them. Of the identified, there's 45 men and 3 women. And in grave 9, this is just to give you an example of what we find. Grave 9, there's 4 skeletons. We found, separate from the skeletons, 4 wallets, like plastic wallets. And some of them had pictures in them. This is the first, these are the 4 bodies. The first one, we found some gunshot wounds. There's always talk of the testimony in Don Francisco here. I was with him, I remember Don Francisco, and he told me that he went with he was a little kid, he went with his father to the base. And everyone was lined up, and they gave somebody the flag, and then they stood back and they shot 3 guys in the chest, and then in the head, in front of everyone. His father was one of them. And then they made everyone leave. So he doesn't know what happened to his father's body. He never buried him. He has no idea. We found him in grave 9. And we also found those same wounds, shot to the chest, shot to the head. That event happened on February 3rd of 1982 during a flag ceremony. So then that gave us an idea of who could be the other 3. What happened along those days. So we were able to identify another person in that grave, in grave 9, although it says 4 there. And I went to do this notification. So in other words, whenever we identify someone, we don't call them, we don't send them a letter, we go and we sit with the family and we tell them, face to face. This one I did. I don't do many of them anymore, I wish I did. This is probably the most powerful moment of anything that we do. And I told this lady, not only did we identify her husband, but we also found a picture of her that he was carrying in his wallet. Yeah, and when I saw her, I was like, oh my God, this is the lady in the, we didn't have, the wallet was not associated to the body. But as soon as I saw her, I was like, she's one of the pictures. She's a lot younger, of course, but it's her. Eventually, we identified all 4 of them, and the body of Francisco's father, Pedro Lopez Cordova, was given back to him and reburied. And the work continues. Today, right now, we're working in a military base up north, and so far, we have found 12 graves. And again, you can see what it looks like. And this is in the northern part of the country, so the soil is looks a little different. It's harder. It's limestone. So that's why the graves are not very deep, because it's really hard to dig in, and because the people who dug these graves were probably the perpetrators. They didn't care, as long as they could get them under the ground somehow. And you can see again, tied, hands, feet, the whole thing. So that's what I do. This is the last time that Clyde came to visit us with Eric Stover. Eric Stover was a person that he came with in 1990, and this is with us sitting around, and I had noticed that all the pictures of the disappeared are in the back. After he was cremated, he asked for his remains, his cremated remains, to be put in that well with the disappeared and in Comalapa. So in 2 different sites, Clyde asked for his remains. He said, I want to live among the disappeared. And remember Indiana Jones? Finally got to meet him. So thank you very much.
We're going to go right over here. Yeah. Have a seat. Can you hear both of us with these invisible mics? Well,
I hope so. Yeah,
yes.
I'm good.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Freddie. We're going to open up a discussion. I have many questions, of course. I work on Guatemala, and so much of this is very close to my heart. But our students as well had many questions, and they've offered them up here. You all will have the opportunity to ask questions as well, and there are cards circulating. If you'd like to ask your question in person, you're invited to do that. If you'd like to write it down on the card, someone will bring it up to me, and I will sort through those and ask away. So you'll be welcome to do that in a few minutes. Just to start, I was really struck in, and a student noticed this as well, in Maggie Jones's very beautiful article about you and the work of AFG in the New York Times Magazine. She described you as the perfect combination of ambitious ideas and an outsider's fearlessness. So I was wondering, how do you think it mattered in your work that you grew up in New York and you were sort of reintroduced to Guatemala as a young adult? Like, do you think she's right? Do you feel like an outsider in some ways in this process? Or how does that matter?
Yeah, no, completely. I'm a New Yorker. I am. I mean, I studied in New York since I was in 4th grade, and I graduated from Brooklyn College, and I lived in one of the toughest neighborhoods in the Bronx during the worst times, and then lived in Brooklyn also in the worst times. From my block, only my best friend and I are not either dead or in jail. So I came from a place that's very different from my early years, from the middle class, son of a sports legend. In New York, I was just someone who had to make their way. And I think that, although I was also a Boy Scout, combination is a little weird, but it helped me when I got to Guatemala because I didn't understand things. And I always said, no, what do you mean? I need to understand. We need to know. And so I didn't have the complacency that unfortunately I see that a lot of people in Guatemala are subjected to. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that they have, because I don't want to generalize. It just so happens that it's easier just to leave things as they are in Guatemala. And I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that, first of all, because I was only there for a year, and then 2, and then 3. But even now, if you ask me, do you plan to stay? No. I've never planned to stay in Guatemala. Still, I'm trying to come back. And so it's kind of like the mob, right? They keep pulling me back in. So I think that helped, yes, completely. And it also let me make a lot of mistakes and a lot of decisions that no one else would dare to make because, well, they all went to school there and they all knew what happened, and I didn't, and I really did not. So it gave me a lot of room just to have crazy ideas and try to see what happens.
Mm-hmm. If you think about the place of FAFG in kind of the many different kinds of attempts to deal with this past in today's very complicated present, right? And you think of this theme of our semester of bodies that matter. You know, what role do you think the work of FAFG has in the broader efforts toward, you know, truth-telling and justice in Guatemala? Where does it fit?
See, this is where I get in trouble. Because I keep saying I'm not a human rights activist, and when I answer these questions is when sometimes I confuse myself. What I think we're doing is we're building a movement. And it's a movement of families that are being empowered. This is not, again, it's not about the bodies themselves. It's about the survivors. It's about bringing back their rights. It's about making people understand that they're not second-class citizens, that they matter, that they have the right to ask for justice, and that the Guatemalan society as a whole has the right to learn about their own past in the classrooms, which is not happening. Mm-hmm. So every time we identify someone, that family becomes an ally. And the only thing I ever ask is that they talk to others and that they tell others. And my dream is that someday, what happens in Argentina would happen in Guatemala, that on Victims' Day or Disappeared Day, that the streets are filled with families that are screaming out the names of the victims without being afraid. That doesn't happen in Guatemala yet.
Right.
But we're moving, that's what I think we're moving towards, to empowering the survivors, who are mostly Mayan and who are mostly women.
Mm-hmm. There's another very complicated piece of this that I'm a little bit fixated on because of my own interests. But for a very long time, even to this day, it's been very difficult to talk about massacre victims or victims of disappearances as having a political past, or as being involved in any way in resistance or any form of work to end dictatorship or anything like this. As many of you probably know, all forms of that kind of organizing or activism were labeled subversive. That's what would make someone an internal enemy of the state. As a result, there's a silencing of this history in very profound and lasting ways. I'm really curious about how FAFG has dealt with this question, because there's the forensic evidence of what happened, right? But now the step to work with the Shoah Foundation, open up conversations about context, right? The Shoah Foundation is collecting, with FAFG, is collecting oral histories of massacre survivors. You've mentioned this in other presentations, that these conversations begin in a very open-ended way, talk about your childhood, talk about your memories. My question as a historian and as someone who studies activism particularly is, do those conversations also include questions about political activism or organizing, or, did you decide to do that or not do that? If you don't do that, do people bring it up anyway? Like, how do you deal with this in the very complicated context you're operating in?
Yes, it is very complicated. And this is the Guatemalan in me that it's hard to, but yeah, even when I talk about my dad and the reasons, it's hard because of the stigma that especially this country has put on being politically active at that time. And in Guatemala, it would simply cost you your life, or you'd be exiled or whatever. It is one of the questions in our antemortem forms. And every single one of our forms we ask, and people tell. What happens is we try to focus on the physical evidence, and we give that to whatever is not physical evidence, the testimony, to the Attorney General, to the prosecutor's office. But sometimes what you get is people saying, oh, that's why something, of course, they were involved, and it shouldn't matter, right? It shouldn't, because the rules are very clear. The rules of engagement is if you have a weapon and you're firing back, then I can kill you. if you put your weapon down, then I can't. And most of these people were not in combat. Almost, as a matter of fact, I've never, in the 1900 investigations that I've carried out, found victims buried from a combat. It's always been executions, disappearances, massacres, etc. So, but the stigma still exists. How do we deal with it? I mean, it's not something that we talk a lot about, but we also deal with it by investigating cases of the guerrilla. So in other words, the left or the guerrilla groups also committed massacres and disappearances, etc. But the difference is 1.6% of the cases to 98.4% of the cases. With no excuse. Basically the same. You know, they would kill a community because they supported the military, or they would take and disappear a military commissioner. It's the same thing. But yes, I agree with you that it is a difficult issue and one that we should definitely pay more attention to. And when I hear some family members, the more educated family members and that have more ties and that have good jobs and that are older speak, like Sergio Linares, the first person we found from the military diary. When I hear of his brother speaks, he says, my brother was a communist, he was a guerrilla fighter, and I'm very proud of him, and that he tried to change his country. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, you don't hear many people saying those things, especially publicly. But yeah, we still have a lot to go.
Yeah. I've personally had the chance to visit your lab just once, but I was absolutely overwhelmed with just sort of the respect and tenderness with which the staff interacted with the bones. I mean, it was just breathtaking. It's a science lab, but it feels very different from any lab I have ever been in. You can feel the emphasis on the living. I just wondered how that developed and how, with the overwhelming sort of sheer quantity of bones that you have to process, how do you keep that connection to the communities and to those living?
Well, first of all, Clyde. We couldn't do it any other way, or we'd let him down, first of all. But also because there's a lot of people counting on us, and people like Rosalina Tuyuk. So we have a lot of, I'm not religious, but we have a lot of spiritual guides, or at least I always try to be my spiritual guide. And they come over to the office and talk to us and tell us how important the work is for them, and how important the work is for the bodies, for the dead, and how this link between the world of the dead and the world of the living is so important for the surviving family members. And so we incorporate that into the work. We have seminars and we send staff from our DNA lab to the inhumation so they can see how important it is to people. We bring communities in to our labs and do ceremonies in our labs. So we are pretty much integrated into the way of life, just like I would expect from anyone that was looking for a family member of mine. Just like we've had to do in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka or in Colombia. Anywhere we work, we need to make sure that the families are at their most comfortable and at their most trusting point, so we can help them the best way possible to find their loved ones and to find the answers that they're looking for, and to hopefully empower them so then they can empower other people.
So you've been at this for a while now. If you think about the political context when you started and where we are today, how do you think it's changed? Or do you feel like more people are starting to make progress in understanding what's happened or not?
No, I think it's definitely changed. I mean, it's been 22 years since the signing of the peace accords. I've been in Guatemala for 23 and a half years now. And I mean, there's a lot of injustices still, and there's a lot of people who committed these crimes still in power, even today. Or our current president, who was placed there by the military. directly in everyone's view, and people still vote for people like that. I think the biggest challenge for today is coming to terms with it, because what we have is very few voices, but that are very loud and powerful, and a lot of voices that are very low and no one can hear, which are the families. This is exactly where I think that power struggle and that fight for memory is playing out right now. And it will happen, it has to happen, but eventually, like Clyde always said, just let the bones speak, and let the family speak, and just be patient. It will happen. And hopefully once we get it into the school system, that will change everything. Because talks like this never, ever happen in Guatemala, ever. So I think once we do that, and we are doing that now, even we have a couple of small education projects, and with the Shaw Foundation, we're creating lesson plans that are beginning to be put into the schools. Not many schools, but some pilot projects. But it looks promising. Teachers want to teach it, students want to learn it. Of course, it's our history. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah. One of our students in class today asked if you could talk a little bit about your experience conversing with people who just flat out deny the massacres happened or deny that there were acts of genocide. How do these conversations unfold?
Because I grew up in New York, all my friends are in New York, so I really don't have a big social life outside of my family in Guatemala. I travel a lot. And the only group of people that I really saw permanently were the other baseball families. My son is a baseball player. So baseball is not a big sport in Guatemala, but it's a very privileged sport. Two types of people play it: the rich or the kids of the caretakers of the fields, the very poor, right? And there was us, sort of in the middle somewhere, which, I play baseball, so for me it wasn't about those two social strata, it was about baseball. But most of those parents, when they heard what I did, they would just, if I sat here, they sat over there. And I was fine with that. And there was maybe 2 or 3 of them that, we talk, and some of them who follow the work and who are very supportive of the work. But the rest, the other 15 or so families from that economic group, stay away. And we don't have much to talk about because I don't need to convince anyone. I don't do that. And they're not willing to listen. I think that's a big problem because those discussions are not happening.
Yeah.
And when they do happen, they happen very aggressively, right? With accusations and other things. So.
Yeah. So you have a staff now of about 75?
Yes.
Is that right? How do people come to this work? What makes someone decide to have or to try to get a job with you? Or, are they younger?
Different. Yes, most of our staff is very young. They all start when I started, about early 20s, really early on. So we don't have any PhDs. We have quite a few masters, but the majority of our staff has only their undergraduate degree. For what we do, that's what we need, because most of the training we do in-house anyway. What you need to learn to do what we do, you don't learn in a university. If there is a university that teaches, I'd like to know. But I did a master's in forensic and biological anthropology in the UK, and I had more experience than every professor there. And it was tough because the students came to me instead of the professors, and the professors didn't like that. And so it was a little bit of an issue. And then there was, it was England, so there was a lot of we couldn't touch the bones, we had to use gloves. And I'm like, come on, really? That's not how you learn osteology. And there is no actual graves, so how do you learn to, so it's difficult. So what we do is we We hire people really young, and we train them for a long time. The training process is about 1.5 years. The people that come to us almost ready are the geneticists, usually biochemists, because it's lab work, right? It's very standard. And with them, what we have to do is send them out into the field a couple of times, and they're like, oh, okay, this is what we do here. But usually, you're drawn to the FAFG because we exist in social media and in the press, so people know who we are. So I think we get people that are very socially conscious, and they want to, almost every single person that works at the FAFG is Guatemalan. Now we have an Austrian and a Canadian working with us. We used to have a Norwegian. That's it. Mm-hmm. Everyone else is Guatemalan. And it's because I also think that these are long-term processes, and the bulk of it has to be dealt with by people in their own countries. That's what I tell the Colombians and the Sri Lankans and everyone else. Right. But yeah, I mean, you could also get at it from other angles. We do run field schools. And Erica, my assistant, who's Canadian, she came at a field school. She stayed, she volunteered for 3 months, and she was the biggest FAFG fan, and she just happens to be the happiest person on earth. And so it's a treat to have her around. And she's in love with the work, and she understands what it means. So that's what we're looking for. We don't look for degrees, we look for passion. I hire people when I see a sparkle in their eyes, and I know they want to do this. And no matter what, then yeah, that's the kind of people we look for.
Mm-hmm. Can we open up to questions from all of you? Are there microphones circulating?
I want a question from the other room. I got it. All right.
If you have a question, just raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone. There's one right there.
Wait, should I wait for you to read one off of
No, go ahead, please.
Okay. I was wondering if you could describe any government or governmental institution type resistances you faced in your work. Because it seems like things wouldn't go that smoothly, or is that just because I feel like if you're doing activist type work and you're talking about uncovering truths that might not want to stay buried by people in power, does it go less smoothly than what you might imagine? Well, I mean, I imagine it won't go smoothly, but is it worse, or what is it like? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure. There is a National Forensic Science Institute in Guatemala that started about 10 years ago, and they've opted not to do this work. They do current cases, homicides, rapes. And I don't think, that's one of the biggest, I'm not sure if that's what you asked, but one of the biggest misconceptions everywhere else that we go, like places like Colombia that has a very good forensic system, is that they're not used to working with people. They work with the dead. And they're trying to catch perpetrators. We're trying to identify people, the victims. We work with families. The evidence that we gather does help the prosecution catch the perpetrators, but that's not our goal. That's why I don't know the names of all these generals and colonels that are being, I couldn't care less. We care about the families, and so I think, I'm not sure, is that what you asked? Oh, okay. No. See, the thing is, I don't think they've tried. They could. If they wanted to stop us, they can stop us. If they wanted to do something to us, they can do something to us very easily. But I think it's a matter of the amount of support we have from the international community. There was, I think, the killing, the assassination of Myrna Mack. She was an anthropologist studying communities that were being killed in 1990. And I remember I was driving to Brooklyn College when I heard about this, and I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. And I think after that, they think very, very carefully about who they go after. So, for example, in our case, we get death threats. I get accused. I mean, there was a criminal complaint against me, accusing me of 10 different crimes, like receiving international bribes, which are donations, or hating the military, or things of that sort. So I was investigated by the prosecutor's office, and nothing was found, of course. But that type of thing is what's happening, and it doesn't come from governmental organizations or state institutions. It comes from the groups that have something to lose by the work. So the children of the soldiers, or the soldiers themselves, usually they're the ones that want to stop the work.
Hello. I have a question just in regards to where you see your organization working in the future. I don't know if your organization, obviously it's based in Guatemala, but I don't know if your plan was for it to stay focused in Guatemala, or you plan to maybe aid organizations or expand your work to investigate other genocides, such as those in like Bosnia or Armenia, for example. I don't know if that's within the scope of your organization.
I worked in Bosnia for 3 different years, 97, 98, 2000. I testified in 4 trials of genocide, the Srebrenica genocide. About 10 of our staff also worked in Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo. We've had people work in Rwanda, the Congo, Haiti, Honduras, Peru, many places. Doing international work has always been part of what we do, but now we're taking it more seriously. So yes, it is part of the future. As long as it doesn't interfere with the work in Guatemala, yes, we can do international work. And one of the things that we're doing is we started a nonprofit organization here in the US called Friends of FAFG. It's based out of New York, but it has an office in DC. So I have an office in DC. I am one of the founders of that nonprofit in the US. But we realize that no one understands what FAFG is. No one cares about Guatemala. No one understands forensic anthropology. So we're changing it, and we're going to start doing business as Uncover. That's the name of our new. So if you hear of Uncover, that's us. It's Uncover Truth, Uncover Justice. So we're heading in a new direction that's broader. And the idea is to advise families, advise organizations that are searching for disappeared people, or advise prosecutors that need to gather evidence, such as working in Bangladesh. We're working in Bangladesh with the Rohingya population early on, and we're going to be, hopefully, going to be developing a DNA database with them. We're doing the same thing in Sri Lanka right now, and we're doing training in Colombia. We're exhuming with the prosecutor's office in 2 different states in Mexico, in Tamaulipas and Veracruz, and we're going to be doing some training for El Salvador as well. So as long as that doesn't disturb the work in Guatemala, yes. Because for me, again, although I'm from Brooklyn, I'm Guatemalan first, or at the same time. It's not that simple.
Hi. Have there been any psychological services offered to the survivors and the families? Because I'm sure there's been a lot of cases of PTSD and stuff like that. Has anything been offered, or are there no organizations able to do that in that capacity?
We don't offer it, but we work with 2 other types of organizations. So there's the organizations that provide legal accompaniment and the organizations that provide psychosocial accompaniment. So there's about 10 organizations that do that in Guatemala that work with us in every one of the cases, especially in the massacres, because these are community-based killings. ECAP, which is el Equipo Comunitario de Acción Psicosocial. So equipo comunitario, community team of psychosocial action, I guess it would be. They're amazing. And it's mostly women. The director now is from Spain, but mostly everyone else that works there is an indigenous woman. It's a Mayan woman. It's an amazing organization. They work with the communities before, during the exhumation, and after we're done for long term. Because you got to remember, a massacre in a community just happens to be one of the many atrocities. Most of these people have to deal with they lost everything from their land. There's no education, there's no health services, there's a lot of alcoholism. I mean, it's tough. And we don't solve all the problems by finding a loved one. So yeah, psychosocial accompaniment or mental health services have to be strategic in the sense that you do long-term and you provide assistance. However, there's a lot of communities that have provided support systems for themselves for a long time that unfortunately families of the disappeared don't, right? Because the families of the disappeared live in hiding. They live in the shadows. Sometimes the rest of the family doesn't even know something. Because sometimes we've gotten cases where somebody's husband goes missing and the father's like, oof, thank God he's gone because he was going to get all of you killed anyway. And, you know, how does the family live with that? And so that division within families, because of an attempt of protection, it's difficult. And that requires something else. But yes, there is psychosocial accompaniment.
I have a question on a card that I'll ask. This comes up in every one of our classes and every time we get together. This student asked, how do you remain so stoic when dealing with these atrocities? A similar question someone asked was at the actual exhumation sites themselves, how does the team distance itself from the horrors they're uncovering, or do they?
Depends. We have specialized teams. So the archaeologists that are working with the remains, they don't interview people. For me, I can work with the remains all day. I can exhume a grave, I can analyze the bodies. Maybe it's because I have a physical anthropology background, but I can't interview families. I can't take it. Listening to the stories, I just can't deal with it. Whereas I have others like Jenny or Hector, which are part of the team, they're amazing. They do 10 interviews in one day. And it's also, Jenny is a psychologist, right? And Hector's a lawyer. And then we also have social anthropologists. That team is a very diverse team. The other thing is, again, back to Clyde. And Clyde always said, and it's just a principle, if you're going to cry, you cry at night. Not at the grave. Don't let them see you. I'm not saying it's the right advice, but that's what we try to do. I mean, and sometimes people break down. It's normal. So you just step out of the grave and go off to the side and gather yourself and come back. It is hard sometimes to work. I remember this one case. We found a man, 2 daughters. My daughter was just really about the same age. His daughters were 6 and 3 years old. And they were also in a grave. There was an older woman who was not related to them. But the older woman's son was there, and the wife and mother of the 2 daughters, of the 2 kids, was like right here next to me the whole time. And she just would not stop crying. I mean, she just cried and cried and cried for hours. That was hard. But then after a little while, she was laughing and telling jokes. And then I was more surprised by that. I was like, what happened? I guess, you know, you can't cry forever. And even in those spaces, crying and breaking down is healthy. But then also understanding what you're doing is also very important. So I think Clyde's advice was, you know, as long as you can, keep it together. And then at night, you do what you got to do. But when you come back the next day, you have to look professional. You have to be, you represent hope to a lot of these communities, right? And you have to make sure you look like hope as well.
Mm-hmm. Is there another question? There was one right here. Michael, there was somebody here.
Hi, I was just wondering if any of your work has led to any prosecution of any of the people who committed these acts?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, it has. It has led to the prosecution of, I think, 5 ex-Special Forces soldiers from Caibiles for the massacre of Dos R's, where 250 people were killed. They were sentenced to over 6,000 years in jail. 30, which I think, I mean, some people say, oh, that's ridiculous, but I think it's fitting.
Symbolic.
It is symbolic, but it's fitting because they were given, I think it was like 30 or 50 years per each person they killed. I think 30 years, because there was 200 of them. Yeah, I mean, there's, even going back to 1998, I testified in a case of a military commissioner. He was sentenced to 229 years in jail for killing a woman. The civil patrolman from Plan de Sanchez got thousands of years also for committing that massacre. Rios Montt, the general, who was also the head of state, or president by coup of Guatemala, was sentenced to 80 years in jail, found guilty of genocide. Then it was reversed. The case that you mentioned earlier, we'll have a ruling next week. Overall, maybe 10, 11 cases within Guatemala. The case in Spain, and cases of the Inter-American Commission. So yes, more and more, and there's many more cases coming. I think one of the cases that's going to be coming soon is the military diary that we've been talking about this whole week, and others, because with the scientific identifications, now you can make a lot of connections. And there's one case that's going to be probably the biggest case of all, which is Creonpas, the Regional Command Center for Peacekeeping Training Operations, which is a military base in the north part of Guatemala, outside of, about 5 hours outside of Guatemala. We found 565 bodies there. We've identified 148 so far, and those have been attributed. There's 14 people that were arrested and awaiting trial for those cases. One of them, if you saw that Al Jazeera Frontline, is a Faultline piece.
Frontline. Faultline, yes.
Yeah, Faultline. The reporter goes to Congress because one of them is a congressman who was stationed at that base and who was a military intelligence person at the base. And he's charged with, I think, 3 or 6 disappearances. A couple of months later, he stopped showing up, and they stripped him of his immunity. He's a fugitive now. He was also the Secretary General of the FCN, which is the ruling party and the ones that got our current president elected, who is a professional clown, who was. And I don't mean that jokingly, he was a comedian. That the show was on TV, and they did blackface comedy a couple of years ago. So not only was he racist, but he was a bad comedian. But. So he's a professional clown, and now he's a president. Sound familiar? I don't know.
So we can take just one more question. Okay, there's.
So, what do you think should be blamed for the genocide in Guatemala? So, as far as I know, like in Africa, it should be blamed for the underdevelopment in the colonial process. So, what do you think is the main cause, the fundamental cause of the genocide in Guatemala, and what do you think in the future we can make it better?
I'm not sure I understood.
No,
What has caused the genocide in Guatemala?
What caused it?
Yes, this is a rather enormous question.
Well, the basis, I mean, it's a combination of many things, but in Guatemala, the basis of it is the fight against communism during the Cold War, fueled by racism, in a time of post-Cuba, to maintain the status quo and power of a state institution that shouldn't be in power. Other than that, the analysis of it, I don't think I'm the person to give you that answer. I don't know. I can tell you that what we see in Guatemala, according to the Truth Commission, are acts of genocide. And I can tell you that there was a ruling against Rios Montt, or in the Rios Montt case, where he was found guilty of that, of genocide. But what I can tell you is that from what I've seen, most of the places where we work, the victims are civilian victims. They are Mayan victims. There's many, 30% children. There's many women. None of them are armed. None of these killings occurred in any kind of combat. These look like massive executions of one specific group of people because there were one specific group of people. And in the military, there was a slogan that said, Indian seen, Indian killed. Indio visto, Indio muerto. So I think racism was used to fuel those massive killings that were not necessary. And the excuse was the fight against communism during the Cold War. I don't know if that's the answer, but that's all I got.
Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, wait.
Just one quick announcement that Freddy will be outside.
Wait, don't leave. We need to take a selfie.
Freddy will be
I'm
outside
serious,
for
I haven't
10,
taken any,
10 or
so-
15 minutes if you would like to speak with him in person. Okay? And there's time for a selfie. Wave.
All right, wait. Come on, guys. Thank you.